The Pyramid of Neferka lay buried beneath the endless waves of golden sand, its presence concealed for centuries. Legends whispered of its existence, a cursed monument that even the gods dared not disturb. Those who ventured near its hidden depths vanished without a trace, their fate sealed by the shifting sands that seemed to guard the secrets within. As night blanketed the desert, the villagers nearby spoke of strange sounds, low murmurs carried by the wind, as if the very dunes themselves were alive and breathing. At the pyramid's entrance, a grim warning was etched into the blackened stone, the hieroglyphs foreign and unsettling. Unlike the familiar carvings that adorned other ancient structures, these symbols seemed to writhe and shift under the dim glow of the torchlight, as though they harbored a life of their own. Parts of the message were violently scratched out, the jagged marks suggesting a desperate attempt to erase what should never be known. Yet, one phrase remained, clear and ominous: "He who enters will not leave unchanged." The words lingered, a chilling promise that clung to the air like a ghost. Amara, a young and determined Egyptologist, stood at the entrance, her heart pounding in her chest. Unlike those who sought fame or fortune, her quest was fueled by something deeper in need for answers. Clutched tightly in her hands was her grandfather's worn and tattered notebook, its pages filled with cryptic sketches and hastily scribbled notes from his last expedition. Every curve of the hieroglyphs she studied seemed to draw her in, tightening the grip of obsession. As she deciphered the ancient carvings, a shiver ran down her spine, the unsettling sensation of unseen eyes fixed upon her every move. Taking her first steps inside, Amara was greeted by a sudden drop in temperature, the air thickening as if invisible hands pressed against her. The flickering torchlight cast long, dancing shadows that twisted unnaturally along the walls. From the depths of the darkened corridors, a faint whisper began to echo, the language alien and ancient, predating even the earliest Egyptian dynasties. Her heartbeat quickened, the rhythmic pounding loud in her ears. This was no mere tomb for the dead, it was a place that breathed, that watched, that waited. And Amara could feel it stirring, awakening to her presence. Deep within the labyrinth, Amara discovered a doorway unlike any she had seen. It was not crafted from stone, but something disturbingly organic, its surface pulsing faintly like the veins beneath human skin. When her trembling fingers brushed against it, a chilling sensation coursed through Hera, subtle, rhythmic breathing from within the walls. The whispers grew louder, no longer just sounds but fragmented words, disjointed and jumbled, clawing into her mind. For a fleeting moment, the fear overwhelmed her, the urge to turn back almost irresistible. Yet something stronger, something beyond her control, compelled her to step forward. The deeper she ventured, the more oppressive the silence became. Not merely the absence of sound, but a suffocating void that swallowed every noise. The walls around her began to move, a slow, deliberate rhythm that made the dust tremble underfoot. Narrowing on their own, the corridors twisted and reshaped, as though the pyramid itself responded to her intrusion. Amara stumbled, her breath hitching as the once whispered voices turned into a cacophony of screams, not cries of terror, but cruel, mocking laughter that echoed in the chamber. In that moment, the chilling realization dawned upon her: she was not the first to trespass here, but she might be the first to glimpse the true horror entombed within. Amara's journey into the Pyramid of Neferka had only just begun, each step pulling her deeper into the heart of a mystery that defied the sands of time and the will of the gods. The name Neferka had been wiped from history, erased from scrolls, tombs, and the memories of those who once worshipped him. Unlike other rulers, whose stories were immortalized in towering monuments, His name was whispered only in fear, the pharaoh who should not have been. Legends spoke of his pyramid vanishing into the desert, swallowed whole by time. Travelers who claimed to have glimpsed its dark silhouette against the dunes were never seen again. Those who searched for it met fates worse than death, driven mad by whispers that echoed from the shifting sands. Historians dismissed the stories as myths, but ancient texts hinted at something more. They spoke of Neferka's reign ending in an unspeakable sacrilege, an act so vile that even the gods turned away in disgust. His existence was denied, his resting place condemned. But the sands did not forget, and neither did Amara. Amara had grown up on tales of the lost pharaoh, passed down from her grandfather, a man who had vanished chasing the very same legend. He had been an Egyptologist, brilliant yet reckless, obsessed with finding Neferka's resting place. His final expedition had led him deep into the western desert, where he and his team disappeared without a trace. All that remained of him was his worn leather notebook, filled with frantic sketches and cryptic notes scrawled in the margins. Warnings, coordinates, a single phrase underlined twice, not meant to be found. For years, she had tried to decipher his last entries, piecing together fragments of maps and forgotten records. And now, standing on the cusp of discovery, she knew she had to finish what he started. The risks did not matter. Answers lay beneath the sand, and she would not leave without them. Dr. Hassan was the voice of reason, though even he was reluctant to join. An esteemed archaeologist, he had dedicated his life to uncovering Egypt's lost history, but Neferka's legend unsettled him. He had seen too many lives destroyed by the hunger for secrets that should remain buried. Yet, something in Amara's eyes, desperation, determination, made him agree. Someone had to keep her safe. Then there was Marcus, a treasure hunter disguised as an explorer, drawn by the promise of riches buried beneath the sand. He laughed at Hassan's warnings, mocking the so-called curse. To him, ancient legends were just obstacles standing between him and his next fortune. Together they formed a fragile alliance, their goals misaligned but their paths intertwined. Science, superstition, and greed. An expedition built on mistrust. But the desert did not care for their motives. The sand would swallow them all the same. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a sea of golden waves shifting beneath the relentless sun. The air shimmered with heat, warping the horizon, making distant dunes appear as though they were moving. The camels tread cautiously, their feet sinking into the sand with each step. Dr. Hassan rode in silence, his eyes scanning the landscape as if expecting something to emerge from the dunes. The locals had warned them of more than just the heat. They spoke of a storm brewing, but not one born of wind and dust. A storm of whispers, voices that carried on the breeze, calling lost souls to their doom. Amara pressed forward, clutching her grandfather's notebook. She had come too far to be swayed by superstition, but even she felt the weight of something unnatural in the air, a presence lurking just beyond sight. Marcus scoffed. "Ghost stories," he muttered. But as the sun dipped toward the horizon, the wind carried a sound with it, low, distant, almost human. It did not belong to any of them. As night fell, the dunes finally gave way to something unnatural, a towering structure of black stone, its surface smooth and untouched by time. It did not belong in this world. The pyramid stood in eerie defiance of nature, its sharp angles unmarred by the centuries. Unlike other tombs worn by wind and sand, this one had remained unchanged, as if protected by something unseen. It was waiting. At the entrance, ancient carvings shimmered under the torchlight. The hieroglyphs should have been motionless, yet Amara swore they moved, shifting and rearranging themselves when she wasn't looking. She rubbed her eyes, convinced it was a trick of the light. Marcus smirked. "It's just a tomb," he said, stepping forward without hesitation. "Dead men don't scare me." But Amara hesitated. She could feel it now. Something was watching, not from the darkness, but from the very walls of the pyramid itself. Dr. Hassan hesitated, his fingers tracing the worn stone. "We shouldn't be here," he muttered. His voice was firm, but there was something else in it, fear. Marcus rolled his eyes, stepping closer. "Enough superstition. Let's get inside." Amara stood frozen. The carvings along the entrance had shifted again. This time, they had formed a face. Her face. A sudden gust of wind blew past them, carrying something unnatural, a whisper, soft yet unmistakable. The words were foreign, ancient, yet Amara understood them. "Turn back." Before she could react, Marcus placed his hand on the stone. The entrance opened on its own. The moment they crossed the threshold, the torches flickered, their flames bending toward the exit, as if urging them to leave. The silence was suffocating, pressing against their ears like a heavy weight. The air inside was thick, charged with something unseen. It wasn't just the stale air of an undisturbed tomb, it was something more. A presence. Amara's breath hitched. She turned back toward the entrance, expecting to see the desert behind them. But the doorway was no longer there. The pyramid had sealed them inside. Amara led the way through the narrow corridor, gripping her torch tightly. The air was thick with dust, but the silence was worse. It wasn't just quiet, it was unnatural, pressing against them like a living force. Dr. Hassan stopped suddenly, his brow furrowing. "Did we come this way before?" Amara glanced back. The hallway behind them was different. The markings on the walls had changed, the passage narrowing as if reshaping itself. Marcus scoffed. "It's just the dark playing tricks on you," he muttered. But even his voice wavered. Then the torches flickered. The flames bent sideways, as if drawn by a breath. Amara's heart pounded. The walls groaned, shifting subtly, the passages ahead morphing into something unfamiliar. "The pyramid," Hassan whispered. "It's alive." There's no turning back now. The deeper they moved, the stranger the walls became. Carvings of gods and pharaohs twisted under the torchlight, their faces shifting. Then the images moved. Hieroglyphs that had once been still now reformed in real time. The figures on the walls began clawing, their arms reaching out in frozen agony. Their faces, once proud and divine, contorted in fear. Amara stepped closer, pulse racing. "They're not just stories," she breathed. "They're warnings." Dr. Hassan pointed at a new set of shifting symbols. It was them, Amara, Marcus, and himself. But in the carving, there were 4 figures, not 3. "Who is that?" Amara whispered. As if in answer, the torches dimmed, their flames shrinking into weak embers. A shadow stirred in the distance. The 4th figure was not missing. It was waiting. Marcus pushed ahead, eager to escape the oppressive walls. His eyes landed on something glinting in the torchlight, an ornate dagger, its handle encrusted with gemstones. "Now this is what I'm talking about," he muttered, reaching for it. Amara gasped. "Marcus, don't." Too late. The moment his fingers brushed the artifact, his shadow began to change. It detached from the ground, stretching unnaturally, growing longer, darker. It pulsed, shifting like liquid. Marcus stumbled back. "What the?" The shadow moved on its own. It slithered up the walls, then lunged. Marcus screamed as the darkness engulfed him. his limbs convulsed, his body flickering between light and void. His eyes met Amara's for a brief moment, pure terror before his form was consumed. Then, silence. His voice echoed once, twice, then faded. Dr. Hassan clutched Amara's arm. "We need to leave. Now." But the shadow remained, standing where Marcus had been. It turned its hollow face toward them, and it smiled. A narrow tunnel yawned open before them, as if the pyramid itself had guided them there. The air smelled of decay and something older, something wrong. At the end of the tunnel stood a massive sarcophagus, taller than any Amara had seen. Its surface was blackened linen, charred and cracked. There were no offerings, no treasures, only glyphs of warning. Dr. Hassan studied the markings, his face pale. These symbols, they don't speak of a burial, they speak of a prison. Amara's breath hitched. Something about this place called to her. She stepped closer, running her fingers over the smooth surface. And then she saw it. Her name, carved deep into the stone, centuries before she was even born. The sarcophagus shifted. No one had touched it. The sound of fabric shifting from the inside sent ice down her spine. Something was awake. The whispering returned, no longer a distant murmur but a clear voice. Amara's voice. It came from behind the sarcophagus, soft, desperate, calling her name. Dr. Hassan grabbed her wrist. "Do not answer." "I hear myself." The walls pulsed, the voice splitting into many, all speaking her name in different tones, overlapping, urgent. She had to know. She pulled away from Hassan and stepped forward. The closer she got, the louder the whispers became. And then they stopped. The silence was worse. Amara reached other fingers inches from the lid when something on the other side knocked back. The walls shuddered. The glyphs changed. And suddenly, they could read them. The glyphs no longer spoke of a pharaoh. They told a different story. Neferka had not been a man. He had been a vessel. His priests had sealed something inside him, something not meant to wake. The sarcophagus groaned. The linen wrapping slid, slowly unraveling. A hand emerged, not decayed, but smooth, too smooth. The fingers were too long, bending in unnatural ways. Dr. Hassan backed away. "We must not see its face." The pyramid trembled, as though bowing before its true master. Amara couldn't move. Then the whispers spoke one final time. Not in her voice, in all voices at once. "We see you." The lid shattered open. Amara stumbled back, her foot striking the wall. The stone cracked under her touch, then broke apart. She screamed. Behind the stone was not stone at all. It was bone. Dr. Hassan clawed at the walls. Every crack, every fracture revealed more bones, shifting, twisting. The pyramid. Amara's breath hitched. It isn't a tomb. Dr. Hassan's face was hollow with realization. It's a prison. The walls pulsed, as though breathing. The bones moved, shifting toward them. The screams of the pastel who had entered before rose in unison. They were inside a graveyard, and something was waking up. Amara's breath was ragged as she stumbled forward, her torch casting flickering shadows across the chamber. The air felt thick, pressing against her like an unseen force. Then she saw a mirror-like slab, standing unnaturally tall in the middle of the room. She hesitated. The surface was impossibly smooth, not stone, not metal, but something else entirely. Slowly, she stepped closer, her pulse hammering in her ears. She expected to see her reflection, but the slab showed nothing. Then, the image changed. She gasped, staring at herself, but not in the present. The vision before her showed her trapped inside the pyramid, screaming silently as her own voice whispered warnings into the dark. The hieroglyphs on the walls twisted, her name etched into the stone. She was begging herself to leave. Her body trembled. This wasn't a vision. This was a message from the future. Dr. Hassan grabbed her arm, yanking her away. "Don't look at it," he cried. The mirror rippled like water, the image of her future self disappearing into the void. But the terror in her eyes lingered, burned into her mind like a scar. A low groan reverberated through the chamber. Amara and Dr. Hassan turned toward the sound. The sarcophagus was shifting. The ancient wrappings unraveled on their own, peeling away like dried leaves caught in the wind. Amara took a step back, gripping her torch tighter. The air grew colder, as if the room itself recoiled from what was emerging. Then, the figure inside rose. It was tall, emaciated, its skin stretched impossibly thin over its bones. Its golden eyes were hollow, burning with a light that didn't belong to this world. It had no mouth, yet Amara heard its voice pierce her mind. Visions flooded in, empires rising and falling, stars burning out, civilizations lost to time. She saw people kneeling before this being, offering their souls in devotion. It had been here before the pyramids, before the gods themselves. The walls shuddered in response, their engravings shifting as if bowing to their true master. Dr. Hassan clutched his head, his face contorted in pain. "Amara, we should not be here." The entity turned toward them, its golden eyes glowing with something ancient, something endless. Time fractured. Amara blinked, and suddenly, she was somewhere else. She stood in the past, the stone walls around her newly carved, untouched by time. A group of priests stood before her, their faces twisted in terror. They chanted desperately, sealing something inside the sarcophagus. Then she saw herself. Her past self was at the entrance of the pyramid, etching words into the stone. The same warnings she had read earlier. She had been here before. A sickening realization settled over her. The past wasn't something she had discovered, it was something she had already lived. One of the priests turned to face her, his eyes hollow, his voice shaking. "You were never meant to return." Everything blurred. The past bled into the present, the voices of the priests becoming the screams of the pyramid itself. Amara's vision snapped back. She was in the chamber again, but now the entity was watching her. Dr. Hassan grabbed Amara's wrist. "We have to go." But the pyramid had other plans. The walls began to close in, the very structure shifting like a living thing. The floor trembled beneath them. From the ceiling, sand poured down in torrents, twisting midair into the shapes of faces screaming, trapped souls. The exit was gone. In its place, a new path opened, leading deeper inside. The entity raised its hand, and suddenly the sand stilled. Then it spoke not in words, but in pure thought, an offer whispered into Amara's mind. "I can show you the truth. I can give you knowledge beyond comprehension." Amara's breath caught. The truth. The truth her grandfather had searched for. The truth she had risked everything to find. Dr. Hassan shook his head violently. "Number Amara, you don't want this." The entity extended its hand. It was her choice now. Time slowed. The pyramid rumbled, the weight of its ancient power pressing down on her. If Amara accepted the offer, she would know everything. She would understand the mysteries of the universe, the secrets her grandfather had given his life for. But she would never leave. If she refused, she might never know what had called to her all these years. The relic lay on the ground beside her, its inscriptions glowing faintly. She reached for it, her fingers trembling. The entity's golden eyes burned brighter. "Choose." Amara swallowed. The choice was clear. She clenched the relic in her fist-hand, spoke the final words of the inscription. The chamber shook violently. The entity let out a sound, not a scream, but laughter. Crumbling like dust, Amara screamed as the floor cracked beneath her. Sand rushed in, filling the room, pulling everything down. The entity did not fight back. It only laughed, a deep, resonant sound that echoed through time itself. Dr. Hassan grabbed her arm, pulling her toward what remained of an exit. "Move!" The relic in her hand burned, its inscriptions fading as the pyramid swallowed itself. The entity's laughter grew fainter, but the meaning behind it was clear. It wasn't gone. It was waiting. With one final push, they escaped into the desert, tumbling onto the sand just as the last stone vanished beneath the dunes. Amara coughed, staring at the empty space where the pyramid had been. It was as if it had never existed. But deep in her mind, the whispers remained, and she knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Amara gasped for air, her body trembling as she crawled out of the sand. Her hands clawed at the ground, struggling to pull herself free from the suffocating grip of the desert. The cool night air hit her skin, but it did nothing to soothe the burning sensation coursing through her veins. She collapsed onto her side, her breath ragged, her mind reeling. Her fingers trembled as she looked down at herself. Symbols. Strange, ancient symbols etched into her flesh, glowing faintly beneath the moonlight. She touched them, expecting pain, but there was none. Instead, they felt familiar, as if they had always been there. The desert around her was silent. No wind, no shifting sand, just an eerie stillness, as if the world itself had stopped. But then faint whispers stirred at the edge of her hearing. Distant, yet somehow close. Something was still with her. Amara forced herself to stand, her legs weak beneath her. She turned toward where the pyramid had once stood, expecting to see its broken ruins rising from the sand. But there was nothing. The desert stretched endlessly before her, smooth and untouched, as if the structure had never existed. No rubble, no remnants, just an unbroken sea of dunes. Her chest tightened. She spun around, searching desperately for Dr. Hassan, for Marcus, for anyone. But she was alone. Her footprints were the only marks in the sand. No sign of her team, no sign of their journey. Had they even been real? Had any of this been real? A sudden wave of nausea washed over her. Her mind screamed for logic, for reason, but there was none. The desert had swallowed everything, everyone. Only she remained, and the whispers. Amara's throat was dry, her body exhausted. She spotted a small puddle nearby, a remnant of the cold desert night. She stumbled toward it, falling to her knees, desperate for relief. But as she cupped the water in her hands, she froze. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't her. The face in the water was wrong. The shape was the same, but the eyes were golden, hollow. Neferka's eyes. Her heart pounded. She jerked back, the water rippling violently. But for a fleeting moment, before the image faded, her lips moved. She hadn't spoken, but something wearing her face had. The soundless words burned into her mind, a whisper that sent ice through her veins. "You are mine." The water stilled. Her reflection returned to normal. But she knew the truth. It wasn't her anymore. Amara turned away from the puddle, her pulse racing. She had to leave, to get as far from this place as possible. But with every step she took, the whispers grew louder. They weren't carried by the wind. They weren't behind her. They were inside her. She clutched her head, her breathing uneven. The whispers knew her name. They spoke in many voices, overlapping, endless. Some were familiar, some were her own. A horrifying realization struck her, freezing her in place. The entity had never been trapped in the pyramid. It had never been bound to the ruins. It had been waiting, and now it was inside her. She had not survived the pyramid. She had become part of it. The final horror wasn't what she had escaped. It was what she had brought back with her. The whispers would never stop, and neither would she.